Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Story 1. The Rat Catchers of London, Unsung Heroes of the Black Death. London. The year is 1348. The cobbled streets of the city are alive, but not just with people. Beneath the bustle, under floorboards, behind grain sacks, and in the filth-strewn alleys, a more insidious presence scurries. Rats, black, brown, fat, thin, pregnant, dying. They are everywhere, and no one seems to notice, at least, not until it's too late. This is the beginning of a very different kind of plague story. You're not a noble nor a knight. You are a rat catcher, or as they were called then, a mouser or ratman. No records will remember your name. You won't appear in a ballad, a poem, or even a family tree. But in the trenches of urban disease, you are one of the first and last lines of defense. This is your story. London before the storm. Before the Black Death truly took hold, London was already struggling under the weight of its own growth. With a population exceeding 50,000 in the mid-14th century, the city was noisy, pungent, and unregulated. Chamber pots were emptied directly onto the streets. Open sewers wound their way between houses. Slaughterhouses and butcher stalls lined the same alleyways children used for play. It was, by all definitions, a breeding ground not just for rats, but for the deadly fleas they carried. In this world, the rat catcher had a unique social position, simultaneously despised and desperately needed. You were thought to bring bad luck, and some even believed your trade was the source of disease, not its solution. But when food spoiled and barns emptied, they called for you. When bobbies cried from bites in the night, they called for you. When the scratching in the walls became unbearable, you came. Your tools were simple: a sack, a staff, sometimes a ferret, and often a small, wiry dog trained to chase and kill. You rarely had gloves, never had masks, and didn't know what infection truly meant. But you knew the smell. You knew the sound of infested walls. You knew how to spot the droppings behind the baker's oven or hear the faint squeak under the blacksmith's floorboards. A life lived among vermin. Being a rat catcher was not an occupation one aspired to. It was, more often than not, inherited or thrust upon the desperate. Widowers, orphans, and those with no guilds to protect them often found themselves chasing tails for a pittance. Payment was inconsistent, sometimes a few pence per rat, sometimes by the sackful. Occasionally, you might barter for food or shelter instead. Despite the lowly status, some found grim pride in the work. You knew you were keeping shops open and homes less chaotic. You learned to distinguish the breeding habits of Norway rats versus black rats. You could tell by looking at a pile of droppings how many rats were nearby and what they'd been eating. But it was dangerous work, not just because of the bites or scratches, but because of what we now know. The fleas carried by these rats, specifically Xenopsilochiopes, were the primary vectors of the Yersinia pestis bacterium. In your world, though, the only word for it was pestilence. You didn't know you were playing roulette every time you reached into a nest. The first signs. When the first reports of sickness began to circulate in 1348, many in London dismissed them as foreign tales. Stories of Genoese ships arriving in Sicily with dying sailors sounded distant, even fanciful. But soon, the signs were harder to ignore. People began to collapse in the markets. Priests were called to administer last rites by the dozens each day. Bell ringers, responsible for signaling deaths, themselves began to vanish. And then came the smells. As a rat catcher, you noticed it before others. a certain rottenness in the air more than usual. Rats, your familiar foe, began to act strangely. They wandered in daylight. They moved sluggishly, and many were already dead when you arrived. Some rat catchers saw their own ranks diminish. Men who'd been in the trade for decades suddenly took ill, developed boils, what we now know as buboes, and died within days. There was no time to analyze, no time to mourn. There were simply too many rats, too many people calling for your help. And so you carried on. Strategy, superstitions, and missteps. You did what you could. You began to burn nests. You boiled water more frequently, though not always for hygiene. You listened to whispers in the taverns, that cats were to blame, or the air, or Jews, or the wrath of God. Some rat catchers began wearing small charms, animal bones, holy relics, even rat skulls to protect themselves. Others turned to more bizarre methods, smearing themselves in vinegar-soaked herbs, hanging onions in doorways, or carrying posies under their nose. The famous rhyme, "Ring-a-ring-o roses," would emerge generations later as a morbid echo of these coping mechanisms. The city's response was fragmented. Wealthier districts tried to wall themselves off. Some boroughs paid bonuses to those who could clear entire streets. But as the months dragged on, it became clear no class was safe. And you, dear listener, walking from house to house, always a little too late, were always at risk. Still, you persisted. A trade that turned grim. By 1349, nearly a third of London's population had succumbed. The death carts rolled day and night. Graveyards overflowed. The rat population, ironically, dwindled as their food sources dried up. But the fleas found new hosts: humans. The disease had mutated from bubonic to pneumonic and possibly even septicemic strains. You didn't know the words, but you saw the results. Some rat catchers were found dead, their sacks half full. Others simply vanished, never seen again. And yet a few remarkably survived. Those few would live on to train the next generation, passing down crude but vital knowledge. The best places to find nests, the most effective burning herbs, the signs of infestation before it spread. They would tell stories of those dark years, of scraping rat guts from doorways, of digging through hay for the one elusive nest, of holding their breath against the stench of rotting vermin, and of watching, helpless, as entire families succumbed while the scratching in the walls continued. Quiet, persistent heroes. Modern historians rarely mention these men and women. Their names are not etched into stone, nor kept in the official rolls. But without them, London might have suffered even greater losses. Their crude tactics, born of necessity, began a lineage of pest control that continues today. They were, in their own way, a line of defense. And now, centuries later, we might ask, how many of them truly knew that the rats were not just a nuisance, but a death sentence? Or were they just doing a job, unaware they were wrestling with history itself? By early 1349, London was no longer a city bustling with life, it was a city murmuring with dread. Bell towers no longer chimed every hour, the bell ringers had died. Bakers, ovens stood cold, and alleyways grew quiet except for the distant wails of grief and the persistent skittering of rodents. A cloud had settled over the city, one not of smoke, but of despair. And amidst it all, the rat catcher still moved. A solitary figure between homes, hovels, and halls, one of the few who dared to enter plague-stricken dwellings after the priests had left and the rats had taken back their corners. This was the new reality, not just catching vermin, but navigating the collapse of a social order. Life under quarantine. While there was no unified medical understanding of contagion, fear had spread faster than the pestilence. Town criers began declaring quarantine orders not by royal decree, but from frantic local councils or desperate neighborhoods. Entire homes were boarded shut, marked with red crosses and the grim message, "Lord, have mercy upon us." Inside these sealed houses were the sick, the dying, and always the rats. Rat catchers were sometimes among the only outsiders willing to approach these homes, not because they were fearless, but because the job paid in coin, bread, or favor. But it wasn't just about money anymore. For some, the work became personal. You might remember the home of a brewer who always offered ale when you cleared his cellar, or the butcher's family whose young boy had proudly helped you set traps. Now, those same homes had crosses painted on the doors. If they needed help, who else would go? It was here that your job evolved. You weren't just catching rats. You were delivering small barrels of vinegar, carting out the dead, sometimes even dragging mattresses to the burning pits. Every visit was a risk, but you had long since learned that survival didn't come from staying still. Improvised sanitation and scattered wisdom. The rat catchers, unlike most physicians of the age, dealt with the physical evidence of plague every day. Their cures may not have held medical merit by modern standards, but they were rooted in observation. For example, many began burning straw used in rat nests instead of reusing it. Some boiled their tools in water mixed with sage or thyme. Vinegar-soaked cloths were worn across the face not because of science, but because the smell of death was so strong. A few used sulfur smoke to drive rats from cellars, accidentally fumigating homes in a crude form of disinfection. Much of this was learned through painful experience. Rat catchers talked to each other at alehouses, in alleyways, even at the mass graves. They shared tales of which homes were worst, which neighborhoods were overrun, and which tricks seemed to work, if only for a little while. It was knowledge born of necessity, passed by word of mouth and deed. Competing trades and fatting guilds. Before the plague, London's guild system regulated nearly every profession. Even pest control in some areas required permits or fees to operate near market centers. But as mortality soared, oversight vanished. Guilds collapsed when their leadership died. Churches, once powerful protectors of local order, became overwhelmed. The chain of command rusted away in the face of plague. This sudden vacuum gave rise to chaos and opportunity. Other tradespeople began to dabble in rat catching. Gravediggers, carpenters, and even tavern workers moonlighted in the trade. But they lacked the skill and, perhaps more importantly, the stomach. Many fell ill after brief forays into the darker corners of the city. Some took to burning entire homes where infestations were worst, especially if the owners were dead. The seasoned rat catchers kept to their territories, grumbling about the amateurs but knowing full well that their work, unpleasant as it was, remained necessary and lucrative. Still, prices had changed. Food cost double what it once did. Coin had less value. What mattered was survival. For some, the price of clearing a home of rats was now a loaf of bread or a sack of dried beans. It was no longer a job, it was barter in a city whose systems had collapsed. Public perception and fear of the catcher. Ironically, even as their importance grew, rat catchers became more feared. People whispered that ratmen brought the disease with them, that they spread death as they moved from house to house. After all, didn't they go where the dying lay? Didn't they emerge from sealed homes with stained hands and soot-covered cloaks? Children were told not to speak with them. Shopkeepers sometimes refused to serve them. And yet, these same shopkeepers often called them when the scratching in the walls returned. One London chronicler, Thomas of Southwark, noted in his parish roll a strange pattern. In several blocks, the only person seen moving regularly between plague houses was a vermin hunter, always with a limp, always with a burlap sack. That entire street, he said, suffered fewer deaths than others. He wondered briefly if the man had some holy protection. Or perhaps he simply knew where the rats lived. The burial pits and their echoes. Rat catchers became familiar with the plague pits. These were massive burial grounds dug outside the city or wherever space allowed. No gravestones, no ceremonies, just trenches of bodies covered with lime and earth. Many plague victims weren't buried by family, they were collected by the death carts, but rat catchers sometimes helped carry them out, especially if they were neighbors or if a coin was offered in exchange. Some catchers began noticing something odd. Where rats clustered, death followed. Where rats were absent, the houses sometimes survived. It wasn't universal, but the pattern was enough to be unsettling. Some even claimed that killing rats was the reason they had not fallen ill. A few began to believe that the rats themselves were not just harbingers but a test, sent by God perhaps to punish the greedy or test the pious. In such darkness, spiritual explanations flourished. Whether by faith or desperation, the catchers carried on. The final weeks of the first wave. By late 1349, the plague began to slow, not because of medical breakthroughs but because there were fewer people left to infect. London was quiet. The Thames flowed on as always, indifferent to the death it carried away. The rats remained, though in fewer numbers. So did the catchers. Those who survived emerged into a different world. Streets were emptier. Homes stood boarded and untouched. Entire professions had vanished. Fields outside the city were overgrown. But for those who endured, including the pest catchers, opportunity waited. Some were hired by landowners to clear manors long abandoned. Others ventured to nearby towns, offering their services where fear still ruled. A few, quietly and without ceremony, became modestly wealthy, not because their work was now honored, but because there were fewer mouths to feed and fewer hands to compete. The job continued. There were always more rats. A legacy written in silence. Modern histories often credit physicians, nobles, and the church for whatever order survived the Black Death. But the rat catcher leaves behind no formal record. No preserved diary, no guild charter, no memoirs. Only scattered mentions in tax rolls or court fines, often for vagrancy or working without a permit. Yet they played a vital role. They were among the only people who routinely entered plague-stricken homes, saw the patterns of death, and acted however crudely to interrupt it. Their methods, born of pragmatism and fear, became the building blocks of early sanitation practices. And still, we must ask, did they understand the full weight of their work? Did they realize they were not just ridding homes of pests, but perhaps buying precious days for the families within? Did they suspect that in the darkness of London's alleys, they were shaping a future where cleanliness and survival would finally be seen as inseparable? Or did they simply do what they had always done because no one else would? The plague receded, but London did not return to normal. It could not. A third, possibly more, of the city's population had vanished. Parish rolls were blank. Churchyards were overgrown. The bells that once tolled with the bustle of life now sat still, as if unsure what they were supposed to announce in this new silence. Yet amid this emptiness, movement slowly returned. Doors unbarred. Markets reopened with fewer stalls. Fields outside the city were reclaimed, sometimes by children no older than 12, now heads of households. People learned to live again, not by forgetting the plague, but by adapting around its memory. And in this cautious new world, the rat catcher remained. A new city shaped by death. Post-plague London was a city trying to rebuild without blueprints. Whole professions had died out. Apprenticeship lines had been severed. Some streets were entirely depopulated. Others had been taken over by squatters or left to the elements. Guilds, once gatekeepers of trade and knowledge, were weakened. In their place, more informal networks emerged. Local knowledge passed mouth to ear, tools handed down between surviving neighbors. The rat catchers, who had never fully belonged to any guild, now found themselves strangely in demand. With fewer people came more vermin. Storehouses were loosely watched, food poorly secured. The rats returned, less visible perhaps, but just as persistent. And those who remembered the plague truly remembered it, knew what that scratching might foretell. They called for the rat catchers not just as exterminators but as advisors. Where should barrels be stored? How far from a water source should food be kept? Should cats be reintroduced? And always, have you seen fleas? The city began to change, slowly. Sanitation begins with a trap. It would be wrong to credit the rat catchers with modern sanitation. They had no microscopes, no scientific method, no centralized policy. But they had habits born of survival, of trial and error that gradually became routine across the city. Homes began to separate food storage from living areas. Trash was more often burned or taken outside the city. Some households began whitewashing their walls with lime, not because it looked nice, but because a rat catcher once said, "The fleas don't like it." Boiling water became more common for washing rags and tools. Drains and cesspits were periodically checked because rats liked them too. The city's officials took notice slowly. By the 1360s, several boroughs introduced rudimentary vermin ordinances, encouraging citizens to maintain cleaner homes and penalizing those who allowed infestations to grow. It wasn't public health as we know it, but it was a start. And it had grown, in part, from a man with a stick, a sack, and a stubborn refusal to stop catching rats during the worst plague in living memory. Recognition never came. The rat catchers never rose in station. They didn't get plaques. No monuments were erected. Even city records only reference them indirectly payments for removal of pests or fines for disturbing the street. Their work remained undesirable, smelly, and often dangerous. But among commoners, especially in the poorer boroughs, they earned a different kind of respect. They were known, remembered. A rat catcher who survived the plague became something of a folk authority. His word might not carry weight in the court, but in the tavern or the tannery, it could settle disputes about cleanliness, disease, or home safety. Some catchers trained their sons, passing down not just traps but techniques. Others took on apprentices, forming early versions of pest control companies, though few would call it that. Most continued working until they died, either from injury, illness, or simply age. They did not expect fame, only survival. The return of the plague and lessons remembered. The Black Death was not a one-time catastrophe. It returned to London in waves throughout the next 3 centuries. Smaller outbreaks in 1361, 1369, and later up to the Great Plague of 1665 kept the threat alive in public memory. But each time it returned, cities responded a little faster, a little smarter. The rat catchers were always part of that response. Sometimes unofficially, sometimes hired directly by local wards to survey neighborhoods, remove nests, or even offer advice on where quarantines should begin. Their hands-on experience gave them a kind of authority that no university degree conferred. In some towns, families recalled which homes had been rat-free during earlier plagues. They brought in catchers preemptively. They paid for inspections, crude though they were. A few rat catchers became respected pest masters, operating from modest shops, selling herbal repellents and handmade traps. It was still filthy work, but now, finally, it was understood to matter. The echoes in modern cities. Today, few think of rat catchers when we speak of public health. We think of doctors, scientists, sanitation engineers. But at the root of every organized response to pest-borne illness is a truth rat catchers knew centuries ago. Survival depends on what hides beneath our floors and behind our walls. The idea of routine inspection. The habit of separating food and waste. The understanding that small creatures can bring large consequences. These were not invented in laboratories. They were learned in alleys. And if you walk the streets of London today, beneath the hum of electric lights and the hum of traffic, you might still catch a glimpse of movement in the corner of your eye. The rats are still here, but so are the systems meant to stop them, many born in the footsteps of nameless catchers, trudging through plague-sick streets. Final thoughts. The Black Death reshaped Europe, economically, socially, and spiritually. But it also reshaped the way humans thought about their surroundings, about cleanliness, about proximity, about unseen dangers. And those realizations didn't come solely from scholars or clergy. They came from people like the rat catchers, who walked into the heart of the plague not with sermons or studies, but with burlap sacks and ash-smeared boots. They didn't end the plague, but they kept it from spreading faster. They didn't receive honors, but they deserved remembrance. So the next time you hear a story about the great sweep of the Black Death, the royalty, the doctors, the monks, pause for a moment. Imagine the soft rustle in the walls. Imagine the man standing outside, sack in hand. And ask yourself, how many lives were quietly saved by someone no one bothered to name? Story 2. Boiling water and burnt bread, medieval medicine and misconceptions. You wake up in a dim, damp chamber in the year 1352. The air smells faintly of soot, sweat, and something vaguely herbal, though not quite pleasant. You are sick. Not dying, not yet, but something is wrong. Fever grips you in waves. Your joints ache. Your mouth is dry. You need a healer. But this is medieval Europe. The word doctor doesn't mean what it does today. And the tools available to treat you include boiled urine, burnt bread, and a whole lot of praying. This is not a story about miraculous recoveries. It's a story about how people tried, often desperately, often misguidedly, to survive illness in a time when the body was still a mystery and disease was blamed on the stars. The four humors, a guiding misbelief. At the root of most medieval medical practices was a theory that dated back to ancient Greece, the balance of the four humors. These were blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness, it was believed, resulted from an imbalance among them. Got a fever, too much blood, feeling sluggish, probably too much phlegm. And so the treatments followed the theory. Bloodletting was one of the most common procedures. Leeches, knives, or cupping were used to draw blood, sometimes several times a week. Phlegm was expelled with purgatives, often bitter or dangerous herbs. Bile imbalances were addressed with vomiting, fasting, or bizarre dietary changes. There was no microscope, no germ theory, no knowledge of viruses or bacteria. But there was a lot of confidence in charting your condition by looking at the moon or analyzing your urine by sight, smell, and occasionally taste. Who treated you? It depends on what you could afford. Medicine in the Middle Ages existed on a sliding scale, determined largely by wealth and location. Physicians were trained sometimes loosely in universities, though these were more philosophical than practical. Their tools were astrological charts and handwritten copies of Galen's teachings. They rarely touched the patient. Barber surgeons, meanwhile, were practical men with knives. They shaved beards, extracted teeth, drained boils, and set bones. Their work was bloody, but sometimes more effective. Wise women and herbalists treated local villagers. Their knowledge was empirical, passed down through generations. They made poultices, teas, tinctures, some of which actually worked. And then there were monastic healers. Monks and nuns operated infirmaries using prayer, herbs, and clean linen. While piety guided their hands, they had something else that helped: cleanliness. Yet none of them, no matter how skilled, had antibiotics, antiseptics, or anesthesia. Even the best care often ended in infection. Common ailments, uncommon remedies. Let's say you suffered from a toothache, you might receive a hot poker to cauterize the nerve, an application of burnt onion and vinegar, or if things were severe, removal with no numbing, followed by salt rubbed into the gums. Stomach troubles, you'd be given warm beer, dried mint mixed with wine, or in some regions, ground oyster shells. If you had a fever, you might be bled repeatedly, or placed in a tub with hot water and rose petals. Bread might be burnt black and crumbled into a tonic with goat's milk. Burns were treated with honey and linen. broken bones with wooden splints and prayers, wounds with spider webs soaked in oil. And through it all, no one understood infection as we do now. Yet here's the thing, some of it worked. Honey is antibacterial, mint soothes digestion, warm compresses reduce pain, but the reasoning was always wrong. They didn't know why anything worked. They just kept doing what had always been done. The role of religion, healing or hindrance. The church played a central role in medieval life and in medicine. Many believed that illness was punishment for sin. Healing, therefore, required confession, repentance, and divine intercession. Pilgrimages to shrines such as those dedicated to St. Thomas Becket or St. Roch were considered viable cures. Monasteries ran some of the best hospitals, though these were more like hospices. Their gardens grew medicinal herbs. Their records, written in Latin, documented treatments, but they emphasized the soul over the body. If you were gravely ill, you were just as likely to be anointed with holy oil as given a herbal remedy. And if you died, well, your suffering was seen as purification. This intertwining of health and morality often slowed progress. Dissections were rare and frowned upon. Scientific curiosity was considered dangerous, and midwives, especially knowledgeable ones, sometimes found themselves accused of witchcraft. A day in the life of a patient. Let's return to your fevered self, lying on a straw-stuffed mattress in a room lit by tallow candles. A healer arrives. He smells faintly of lavender and sweat. He examines your tongue, asks about your dreams, and consults a small astrological chart. He decides your humors are hot and moist. You need cooling. First, he bleeds you just a little. Then he burns a mixture of herbs over coals, chamomile, rue, sage. You're told to inhale. He rubs a paste on your chest made of mustard seeds and goose fat. He places a poultice of boiled bread and wormwood on your stomach. And then he prays. You may recover or worsen, but one thing is certain, you've been treated as best anyone knows how. The limits of medical knowledge. It's easy to laugh at these treatments from a modern perspective, but these were not stupid people. They were working with what they had, bound by religious authority, lacking tools, and relying on fragments of ancient texts. The rediscovery of Greek and Roman medical knowledge during the Crusades sparked some improvements, but also reinforced bad ideas. Galen's errors, particularly about anatomy, were repeated for centuries. And the Black Death, when it arrived, shattered what little faith people had in medicine. Doctors fled, priests died, nothing worked. This left many questioning the value of scholarly medicine and turning, instead, to local healers, herbalists, and trial and error. Ironically, this shift born of desperation would lay early groundwork for empirical observation. Final thoughts for Section 1. Medieval medicine was a strange blend of ancient texts, spiritual guidance, herbal lore, and sheer guesswork. It was, by modern standards, deeply flawed, but it was also a reflection of human resilience, of people trying to fight back against pain with the tools at hand. So next time you unwrap a bandage, swallow an aspirin, or see a surgeon in a sterile mask, consider this. Not so long ago, your ancestors were boiling water, burning bread, and praying to the stars, hoping that would be enough. But why did some of their strange remedies survive for centuries despite never really working? When you think of a healer in the medieval world, you might picture a solemn man in robes, clutching a scroll or turning the pages of a heavy manuscript. That figure existed, but he was only one thread in a much larger, messier tapestry. The world of medieval medicine was not a hierarchy. It was a patchwork of beliefs, people, customs, and half-remembered cures. From monastic infirmaries to forest huts, from dusty university halls to bustling marketplaces, healing could come in many forms and from many hands. Some of those hands belonged to midwives, some to monks, and others to mud-streaked peasants who simply remembered what their grandmother had done when the fever came. This was medicine before medicine became a science. The monastic infirmary, quiet, clean, and full of herbs. In a world where most people never learned to read, monasteries were islands of literacy and order. Monks copied texts, kept records, and tended gardens not just for food, but for healing. Benedictine monasteries, in particular, often included an infirmary, usually a small building apart from the main cloister. Here, the sick were treated with rest, warmth, and prayer. But monks didn't rely on prayer alone. They used herbal remedies, grown in their physic gardens: chamomile, rosemary, fennel, and more. Dietary adjustments, like broth made from leeks or barley. Bathing and clean linens, which, though not fully understood, did reduce infection. They believed cleanliness was next to godliness. In practice, it also kept their patients from dying of sepsis. However, monks were not trained as physicians. Their remedies came from experience, trial, and faith. Still, in many communities, monastic infirmaries were the closest thing to hospitals: calm, clean, and better than bleeding on your own floor. The midwife's knowledge. If the monastery was the domain of male learning, the midwife held court in the home. She was often one of the few women in a community who had medical authority, and she wielded it with quiet confidence. Midwives did far more than deliver babies. They treated infections in women and children. They applied poultices to wounds. They knew which herbs would induce labor or reduce bleeding. They cared for newborns, elderly neighbors, and everyone in between. Most of their knowledge came from practice and oral tradition, passed from one generation to the next. Some kept recipe books not written in Latin like physicians, but in vernacular languages, practical and precise. But their power came at a price. As the church's influence grew, some midwives were accused of witchcraft, especially those who operated outside official church approval. The same hands that healed could be seen as dangerous. Still, they remained indispensable. If you were sick and poor, your first call was not to a university-trained physician. It was to the midwife who lived down the lane. Folk healers and cunning folk. Outside the monastery and the home, there were healers known by many names: cunning folk, wise men, hedge witches, or herb wives. These individuals often straddled the line between medicine and magic. A cunning man might set bones, brew teas from wild plants, cast protective charms, diagnose illness based on dreams or omens. Sometimes they treated livestock and people alike. There wasn't always a clear distinction. Some were respected, others feared. Many walked a fine line between healer and heretic. And yet, many of their methods were surprisingly effective. Willow bark tea, used for pain, contained salicin, now known as aspirin. Mullein, used for coughs, has proven expectorant properties. Comfrey, used for bruises and sprains, promotes healing. They didn't know why these things worked, but they did work at least sometimes. And so their reputations endured, even if their names did not. The urban barber surgeon, knife in one hand, razor in the other. In medieval towns, one figure stood out for his versatility: the barber surgeon. He might cut your hair, pull your tooth, lance a boil, and stitch a wound all in the same hour. Surgeons were considered manual laborers, not real doctors, but their hands-on knowledge made them far more useful in many cases. They dealt with trauma wounds from war, accidents, or brawls, bladder stones and amputations, abscesses, drained with tools often used for shaving. The tools were crude, pain relief minimal, but they knew anatomy through experience more than most physicians, who rarely touched patients. Barber surgeons also practiced bloodletting, using leeches or sharp blades to balance the humors. It was messy, painful, and based on a false theory but widely believed. Their shops often hung a red and white pole outside, red for blood, white for bandages. Even today, that symbol lingers. women in medicine, respected, erased, and rediscovered. Beyond midwives, women played a larger role in medicine than records suggest. They served in households as nurses and caretakers, apothecaries, assistants, mixing herbs and powders, informal diagnosticians, using memory, observation, and intuition. In towns, some women even ran independent medical practices. Trotula of Salerno, a 12th century female physician, authored influential texts on women's health. Hildegard of Bingen, a nun, wrote extensively on healing plants and their uses. Yet their contributions were often minimized or misattributed. Many healing recipes that originated with women were copied by men, translated into Latin, and credited to others. Female knowledge was valuable but rarely celebrated. Still, in many homes, the most trusted healer wore an apron, not a robe. The limits of the learned, what physicians got wrong. University-trained physicians were revered but not always effective. They read Galen and Hippocrates. They studied astrology and humoral theory, but they rarely saw actual patients. Their diagnoses might include bad ear miasma, poor alignment of planets, displeasure of God, excessive black bile. Treatments were often worse than the illness. Frequent bleeding, mercury and arsenic compounds, induced vomiting, restrictive diets lacking nutrition. Their prescriptions were handwritten, costly, and often irrelevant. During epidemics, many fled cities. Others died alongside the people they tried to treat. The failures of academic medicine during the plague led many to seek help elsewhere from monks, midwives, and mud-caked herbalists. And perhaps, just perhaps, that was progress. Final thoughts for Section 2. Medicine in the medieval world was not just practiced by physicians. It was lived by communities, by those who had seen illness up close, who remembered which teas soothed fever, who knew which roots to grind when the cough wouldn't stop. It was messy, it was often wrong, but it was also collaborative. And while the physicians wrote in Latin, the midwives, monks, and mudfolk healed in languages everyone could understand. Care, observation, trial, and memory. But as the centuries turned and new plagues returned, one question remained. Would anyone listen to the lessons learned by these unrecognized healers? It's now the 15th century. The worst wave of the Black Death is decades behind you, but its shadow still stretches long across Europe. The fear of plague still lingers in the alleys. The smell of crushed herbs, burnt offerings, and musty linen still hangs in the corners of sick rooms. But something is beginning to shift. This is the slow, stumbling beginning of transformation where burned bread poultices, whispered blessings, and prayer books begin to coexist with printed texts, anatomical diagrams, and eventually, the first seeds of real medical progress. Not yet a revolution, but a rumble under the surface. The printing press and the spread of medical knowledge. In 1440, Johannes Gutenberg invented the movable type printing press. It may seem like a distant development from the apothecaries and midwives of earlier centuries, but it changed everything. Before the press, medical knowledge was hoarded, expensive, and hand-copied. With printing, medical texts became more widely available. Illustrations of anatomy spread across Europe. Herbal compendiums and remedy books became accessible even to the literate middle class. For centuries, much of European medicine had leaned on ancient sources Galen, Hippocrates, Avicenna. But now it became easier to compare, revise, and question those old ideas. Some books still promoted humor theory and planetary influence, but others included new ideas like the importance of observation or cautions against excessive bloodletting. The common people could read too, and folk remedies began appearing in printed collections. You still might rub burnt bread on your skin or drink sage tea for digestion, but now you could read a dozen other suggestions as well. the monopoly on medicine had begun to weaken. Dissection and the courage to question. One of the most significant shifts in medieval medicine came from a source both horrifying and revolutionary: dissection. For centuries, dissecting the human body had been taboo, considered sacrilegious, even criminal. But over time, particularly in Italian universities like Bologna and Padua, scholars began to challenge this. They discovered that Galen, so revered for centuries, had based his anatomical work on animals, not humans. His mistakes were numerous and often dangerous. Blood, it turned out, wasn't made in the liver, and the heart did not have invisible holes between its chambers. Andreas Vesalius, a 16th-century physician and anatomist, wrote De Humani Corporis Fabrica, a landmark book that accurately described human anatomy based on dissections he performed himself. His illustrations were detailed, precise, and public. By exposing Galen's errors, Vesalius helped unshackle medicine from centuries of blind repetition. It wasn't immediate, but the seeds of science were planted. The lingering grip of superstition. Despite the gradual emergence of empirical methods, medieval medicine didn't shed its superstitions overnight. Far from it. Even as anatomy improved and printing spread, many people still believed in astrological medicine. Your treatment depended on the position of the stars. Magical amulets. Certain stones or metals could ward off illness. Divine punishment. Disease was a consequence of personal or collective sin. Charms and incantations. Words held power, especially when spoken over water or herbs. Doctors might chart your horoscope before prescribing a laxative. Pilgrims still walked barefoot to distant shrines, hoping for a healing miracle. Communities hung garlic, rosemary, or iron tools near doors to ward off bad air or spirits. Even with better tools, the human desire for certainty and the fear of the unknown kept these beliefs alive. And who could blame them? When plague returned in the 15th century, even the most educated were powerless. People still boiled water in bread. They still whispered prayers over fevers. Because sometimes tradition was all they had. Empirical observation, the first glimmer of science. By the late Middle Ages, some healers, particularly in cities, began keeping more detailed records. What time of year people fell ill. Which herbs seemed to help certain conditions. Which neighborhoods were most affected during outbreaks. Though they lacked formal training, these proto-observers laid the foundation for epidemiology and clinical medicine. Monks charted symptoms. Physicians documented autopsies. Apothecaries recorded which herbs worked best for wounds, digestive issues, or childbirth recovery. And patients, too, became more informed. With books and urban literacy on the rise, people began making their own remedies, modifying what they read, adding their local knowledge. In a strange way, the chaos of earlier medicine created space for experimentation. When no single system worked reliably, people tried everything. And some of it, through sheer chance or repeated use, began to stick. The rise of city health officials. Another key development was the birth of public health measures. In major cities like Florence, Venice, and London, the repeated waves of plague forced city leaders to take action, not because they understood disease, but because they could see the consequences of doing nothing. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, plague quarantines became formal policy. Ships had to anchor for 40 days, 40 giorni, before unloading. City inspectors were appointed to search for contaminated goods. Lazarettos, plague hospitals, were built to isolate the sick. Waste disposal laws were introduced in some boroughs. These were not medical innovations, but they were practical. The idea that illness could be managed collectively was new. Until then, medicine had been personal, spiritual, or hereditary. Now it became civic. Even if doctors still prescribed bleeding, the city might mandate that rats be trapped and refuse burned. And that marked the beginning of state health. Medicine and memory, what was kept, what was lost. By the time the Renaissance dawned, many medieval remedies had fallen out of favor, but some survived, and others were reevaluated centuries later with new tools. Garlic and honey, long used in folk medicine, are now known to have antimicrobial properties. Willow bark became the basis for aspirin. Herbal teas for stomach ailments often matched modern antispasmodic herbs. But much of what medieval people thought was working was the result of hope, luck, and placebo. The bread was burnt, the water boiled, the fever passed or it didn't. What remained was the memory, the determined attempts to heal, to survive, to ease suffering, however imperfectly. And that memory shaped the next era. Final reflection, from boiled bread to biomedical breakthroughs. The road from medieval medicine to modern science was not a leap, it was a crawl. A slow, uneven walk through centuries of half-truths, brave guesses, tragic errors, and humble successes. In the dim rooms of plague-stricken homes, people did what they could. They burned herbs because it masked the smell. They boiled water because it seemed to help. They applied bread not because they knew it healed, but because it was something warm, absorbent, and available. And these small acts of care, though not always curative, carried meaning. They were gestures of hope in hopeless moments. They were the beginning of observation. They were medicine before medicine had a name. So next time you reach for a thermometer, a bandage, or a simple tea for a cold, remember, your ancestors once did the same, only without certainty. Just a prayer, a poultice, and a crumb of burnt bread. Story 3. The Silent Caravans, how merchants spread disease along the Silk Road. The Silk Road stretched like a vast artery across continents. From the humid ports of China to the dust-choked roads of Persia, through Central Asian cities and into the marketplaces of Europe, it was a lifeline of exchange of silks, spices, gems, ideas, and death. This is not the story of great empires or thundering armies. It is the quieter tale of wagons creaking through steppe winds, of pack animals swaying beneath bolts of fabric, of merchants chewing dried dates as they counted coins, and unknowingly carried a bacterium that would eventually decimate millions. The road itself did not kill, but those who traveled it, those silent caravans linked distant lands not only through trade, but through plague. A network built on trade and trust. By the 13th century, the Silk Road was at its peak under the Mongol Empire's rule. Genghis Khan's descendants had unified vast swaths of Asia under one banner, creating relative safety for traders. It became possible, at least in theory, to travel from the court of the Chinese Yuan dynasty to the Black Sea without changing allegiances. Merchants carried silks soft as water, dyed with crushed insects and rare minerals. Spices such as cinnamon and black pepper, more valuable than gold. Paper and books, spreading knowledge and religious texts. Glass, ivory, jade, and medicine. But they also carried lice and fleas. They camped in stables and caravanseries, inns spaced every 20 to 30 miles where travelers, animals, and vermin mingled in close quarters. Rats fed on grain stores, and fleas fed on rats. Unbeknownst to anyone, in the warm folds of a silk-lined saddlebag or the shadows beneath a merchant's tunic, disease was in motion. Yersinia pestis, the unseen passenger. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, the cause of the plague, didn't care about human ambition or commerce. It simply moved where the hosts did. Infected fleas bit rats, who in turn mingled in stables, markets, and homes. Some modern historians believe the Black Death originated in the steppes of Central Asia, perhaps near Lake Issyk-Kul in present-day Kyrgyzstan. Local outbreaks had occurred there as early as the 1330s. Traders passing through likely came into contact with sick rodents or contaminated goods. The fleas tiny, overlooked and unafraid of borders, hitched rides on fur, cloth, and skin. When caravans departed, they didn't just carry goods, they carried time bombs. The caravanserai, nodes of infection. At each stop along the Silk Road stood the caravanserai, massive inns built to accommodate travelers. Designed as rectangles with central courtyards, they provided water, shelter, and fodder. These were bustling hubs, places of rest and gossip, of barter and prayer. They were also perfect for disease. Close quarters meant fleas could jump from host to host. Shared sleeping spaces allowed rats to roam freely. Animal pens were often part of the compound, bringing human and rodent populations close. Merchants slept here one night, then moved on to the next town. Fleas followed. Those infected often showed no symptoms for several days, long enough to reach a new city, shake hands with a new partner, sell a contaminated bundle of wool. And thus, from Kashgar to Samarkand to Tabriz to Constantinople, the road became a vector not just for wealth, but for catastrophe. Merchants, witnesses to collapse. Many merchants never realized they were part of something so devastating. They were too busy haggling prices, checking balances, loading goods, and avoiding bandits. News traveled slowly, often distorted. A rumor of sickness in a town 200 miles away could easily be dismissed as superstition or competition. But those who survived long enough began to notice patterns. Empty caravanserais, towns that refused entry, border guards wearing amulets and brandishing torches at passing travelers. And then came the first signs within the caravans themselves. A camel driver develops a fever, then a groom, then one of the apprentices. A sore swells near the groin, breathing becomes labored. Within days they are buried in a shallow grave on the roadside. What could merchants do? Turn back. There was no guarantee the road behind was safer, and the goods had to be delivered. Debt obligations didn't vanish with a cough. So they pressed on. Arrival in the West. By 1346, the plague had reached the Crimean Peninsula. There, in the port city of Kaffa, a Genoese trading post on the Black Sea, one of the most infamous events in plague history occurred. The Mongol army, besieging the city, reportedly catapulted infected corpses over the walls, an early act of biological warfare. Fleeing Genoese merchants boarded ships bound for Constantinople, Genoa, and Venice. With them went the rats and the fleas. From there, plague traveled by ship as efficiently as it had by caravan. Within months, it reached Sicily, then mainland Italy, then France, Spain, England, and the rest of Europe. But it began with overland trade. The Silk Road had carried culture, technology, and prosperity. Now it carried death, cloaked in silk, stowed beneath sacks of saffron and pepper. Trade versus survival. As the plague spread, cities tried to respond. Ports closed. Guards turned back merchants. Quarantine laws were enacted in some places, but these responses were uneven and often too late. Commerce didn't stop. It couldn't. Even as cities collapsed, others grew rich supplying funerary goods, grain, or labor. Some merchants profited immensely during plague years, buying up land and goods at fire sale prices. Others vanished from records entirely. Still others wrote, leaving behind diaries and letters describing ghost towns, silent roads, and the fear of fellow travelers. They had lived their lives connecting people, places, and products, but now they feared connection. Every handshake, every barrel, every bolt of cloth was suspect. Final thoughts for Section 1. The story of the plague is often told in terms of symptoms, death tolls, and dark images. But behind every outbreak was a map of movement of people who walked, traded, and unknowingly linked distant towns in a chain of infection. The Silk Road did not cause the plague, but it carried it. And so we ask, how did those merchants, walking through dust and snow, bargaining over bolts of silk, cope with the creeping knowledge that the road they traveled might be leading not just to profit but to devastation. The Silk Road, once celebrated for its vitality and the riches it delivered, became, by the mid-14th century, a pathway of suspicion. Every caravan became a question mark. Every arriving merchant faced wary eyes. Where did they come from? Who had they met along the way? What did they bring with them besides bolts of silk and saffron? Because by now the whispers had become patterns. Townspeople noticed. Sickness arrived shortly after the traders. Rats scurried from wagons. New goods carried unfamiliar smells. And all too often death followed. This was the birth of something new, not just the tightening of city gates, but the slow transformation of how societies responded to mobility, outsiders, and the invisible dangers they carried. The walling of cities, a desperate defense. As plague outbreaks became more frequent along the trade routes, cities adopted increasingly desperate measures. Quarantine was not yet fully understood, but instinct drove action. Many cities built or reinforced walls and gates, not only to protect from marauders, but to limit trade and contact. Merchants were barred from entering, until inspected, sometimes held in remote shelters outside the city. Markets were suspended, inns were shuttered, travelers were told to move on. In some places, entire caravans were burned when illness was suspected. Not all cities had the resources for such measures. Smaller towns simply turned away strangers or resorted to rumor and vigilante actions. And yet the movement continued. Caravans could not stop indefinitely. Goods needed to be sold before they spoiled. Debts waited to be repaid. Even as doors closed, side roads and back alleys opened. The plague, always a step ahead, crept in through every available crack. Quarantine, the birth of a concept. The idea of quarantine, from the Italian 40 giorni, or 40 days, emerged not far from the terminus of the Silk Road's western branches. In Venice, where Eastern goods arrived by ship from the Black Sea, authorities recognized that isolation reduced outbreaks. By the 1370s, ships arriving in Venice were held at nearby islands like Lazaretto Vecchio, where crew and cargo waited for weeks before disembarking. The concept spread. Ragusa, modern Dubrovnik, enacted one of the earliest quarantine laws in 1377. Travelers from plague-affected regions were confined in pest houses on city outskirts. Authorities established plague inspectors who examined goods and health statuses. Though primitive, these efforts were among the first state-sanctioned attempts to break the chain of transmission through enforced isolation. Still, quarantine had limits. Fleas embedded in wool or hides often survived the weight. Not all goods were subject to inspection. Desperate traders bribed officials or found alternate, unregulated routes. The plague moved slower, but it still moved. Merchants as villains and victims. As the death toll mounted, the social perception of merchants shifted. Once admired for their bravery and worldliness, they now inspired fear. Accusations circulated that they poisoned wells, that they brought plague intentionally for profit, that they sought out cursed lands or trafficked in cursed goods. Some merchants were physically attacked upon entering towns. Others were forced to abandon their cargo or pay heavy tariffs to cleanse it. Ironically, many merchants suffered just as much as the communities they visited. Entire caravans died en route, leaving wagons abandoned along the steppe. Merchant families in cities like Tabriz, Baghdad, and Constantinople vanished from tax rolls. The once rich lost their fortunes paying for burial, bribery, or escape. Merchants were not villains. They were vectors, but they were also human, vulnerable to the very disease they unknowingly carried. Adaptation and diversion, trade routes shift. With fear rising along the primary Silk Road corridors, some traders began seeking alternative paths. Coastal routes along the Persian Gulf and Red Sea grew in use, shifting trade onto ships when overland travel became too risky. Mountain passes, once avoided, became active despite their danger, as they allowed caravans to bypass infested towns. Trade through Russia and the north saw brief spikes as southern routes collapsed. These shifts had ripple effects. Some cities, like Samarkand, declined rapidly due to plague and loss of trade. Others, like Trebizond, grew briefly as goods rerouted through their ports. Merchant guilds adapted by employing local middlemen, who received goods at one point and passed them onward, minimizing long-distance contact. But none of these changes could stop the fundamental issue, the interconnectedness of the world. Wherever people moved, the disease followed. The Silk Road, even in fragments, still bound Asia to Europe. Cultural friction and xenophobia. As foreign traders became scapegoats for plague, xenophobia increased. In many cities, non-locals were expelled, especially during outbreaks. Distinctive clothing or language became grounds for suspicion. Traders were forced to carry certificates of health or be inspected by clergy. This suspicion extended even to fellow believers. In Islamic cities, Christians and Jews were sometimes blamed. In European cities, Eastern merchants and Jewish communities were targeted. Such divisions, while not unique to the plague, were amplified by it. Fear turns inward during pandemics. In the absence of science, people reach for someone to blame, and the wandering merchant, unknown, unsheltered, and from elsewhere, was an easy target. Cities that tried to learn. Not every city turned away from reason. Some leaders, especially in major trade hubs, began to collect information and adjust. Bukhara began monitoring deaths in caravanserais and taxing goods differently based on point of origin. Trebizond introduced fees for plague wares and funded guards to inspect shipments. Constantinople, long at the crossroads of trade, established cordons around key markets during outbreaks. These efforts were flawed, but they showed the early signs of something new: systemic response. Before, illness had been seen as fate, sin, or misfortune. Now, some were beginning to see it as a pattern connected to movement, contact, and proximity. The Silk Road taught this lesson through suffering, but some remembered. Final thoughts for Section 2. Trade once connected the world in a dance of luxury and wonder: spices, silks, manuscripts, and stories. But as plague followed those same roads, the mood changed. Hospitality became fear. Curiosity became suspicion. And yet trade did not stop. Merchants adapted, cities learned, some survived, some disappeared. The world was shrinking, but the human heart remained wary. Which leads us to ask, as the road darkened with fear and disease, what compelled the caravans to keep moving? Was it necessity, profit, or a hope that somewhere ahead, the next town would be different? By the end of the 14th century, the Silk Road no longer echoed with the same vitality. Caravans still moved, but more cautiously. The great flow of trade had become interrupted, diverted, and at times abandoned. The road, once a ribbon of culture and connection, had become stained with loss. And yet, in this final chapter of our story, we look not only at the devastation the caravans unwittingly carried, but at what remained, what endured, what lessons emerged quietly in their wake. Because even a trail of death can leave behind paths of understanding. Survivors of the road. Some merchants survived. They returned to cities marked by ash and silence, homes shuttered, business partners buried, credit books filled with names crossed out in charcoal. Some never resumed trade. Others pressed forward, driven by hunger, duty, or a simple refusal to surrender. Survivors began recording what they had seen, either in ledgers, diaries, or letters. One trader from Damascus wrote of entire villages emptied within weeks. A merchant in Herat described a wind that took only the breathing. Genoese notaries cataloged how many ships returned with reduced crews, many down to a single surviving captain. These accounts weren't medical records, but they were patterns, etched in trade routes and inventories, noting which ports, cities, and inland towns seemed repeatedly afflicted. This scattered testimony accidental epidemiology was the beginning of learning. The return of goods and the shift in demand. When the worst of the plague waned, something curious happened. Markets reawakened but with different appetites. Before the plague, silks and spices had dominated. Now demand shifted to preserved foods, as fear of spoiled or tainted goods grew. Locally produced wares, as suspicion of foreign cargo lingered. Tools and ironwork needed to rebuild. Merchants who adapted to these changes thrived at least for a time. Others, unable to pivot from luxury goods, lost fortunes. A subtle transition was underway, from exotic rarity to practical survival. Trade still mattered, but it would never again feel quite the same. The dimming of the Central Road. As the Mongol Empire fractured, so did the protective unity it had provided to traders. Banditry returned. Regional wars broke out. The once reliable caravan routes grew dangerous. Combine this with the memory of plague, and the great overland networks began to wither. Maritime trade, by contrast, flourished. Merchants turned increasingly to Indian Ocean ports, Persian Gulf and Red Sea shipping lanes, direct routes between Venice and Alexandria. Ships could carry more goods in less time, and crucially allowed port cities to enforce quarantine more easily than land routes could. The road itself faded, not completely but decisively. What the Mongols had built as a connective artery, the plague and politics unraveled. And with it, a way of life. What stayed in motion? Yet not everything vanished. Along the bones of the Silk Road, ideas still traveled. Medical knowledge, like the concept of quarantine and the role of proximity in illness. Religious interpretations of the plague, shared and debated across regions. Folk remedies, passed orally from Persia to Anatolia to the Balkans. Even when trade slowed, the memory of the road remained. Cities that once hosted caravans became quieter but retained traces of their importance. Warehouses repurposed as public kitchens. Caravanserais turned into mosques or schools. Abandoned merchant quarters where vines overtook stone. The road became history, but not forgotten. Seeds of a future science. Among the most overlooked legacies of the merchant plague connection was its quiet influence on the development of early epidemiology. By the 15th century, city officials began keeping death rolls that tracked the timing and geography of outbreaks. Cargo records noting which goods preceded flare-ups. Notices of arrival that compared plague incidents with points of origin. This wasn't yet the scientific method, but it was pattern recognition, observational, local, reactive but real. And at the center of these efforts, merchants. Their movements, illnesses, and losses unintentionally forced cities to think more broadly about cause and effect. The caravan became a case study, a symptom, a signal. The long-term cultural impact. Though the plague reduced populations, it also triggered change. Labor shortages meant merchants needed to pay caravan workers more, leading to better conditions for some. Economic realignment forced diversification of goods and routes. Social mobility increased as survivors in trade gained wealth and status once out of reach. And in art, literature, and oral tradition, the merchant became a complex figure. Sometimes a hero, bringing essential goods across great distances. Sometimes a scapegoat, blamed for illness and decay. Sometimes a ghost, remembered in stories of cursed wagons and haunted ports. But always a presence, walking the edge between necessity and danger. The modern echo. Today, we live in a world that moves faster than any caravan ever did. Flights cross oceans in hours. Cargo ships circumnavigate continents. And yet, when disease strikes, when a virus appears, we still find ourselves tracing its path through trade, travel, and contact. The questions that haunted 14th century city still arise. Where did it come from? Who brought it? How do we stop it? We build walls, we close borders, we search for the thread that connects place to plague. And in doing so, we unknowingly follow the footprints of ancient merchants, those who rode camels through desert winds, carried silk across steppes, and met suspicion with silence. Final reflection. The Silk Road gave the world wonders: paper, porcelain, spices, philosophy. It also gave us lessons about what happens when connection turns fatal. The caravans that once symbolized prosperity became symbols of fear. And yet, they carried something more enduring than plague, a mirror to the systems we build, the risks we accept, and the cost of contact. So when you read of outbreaks today, of ships delayed and borders sealed, remember that it's not new. It's a road we've traveled before. Only now the dust is digital, and the rats ride in cargo holds. Still, the question remains: can a world that thrives on connection ever truly protect itself from what rides silently between us? Story 4. When the church prescribed leeches, faith, folklore, and fevers. In the hush of a medieval cathedral, incense wafts through the air as candles flicker against cold stone. Somewhere beyond the choir screen, a man lies groaning in pain, his face blotched, his body burning with fever. A monk stands over him, chanting softly, a leech coiled delicately in a clay bowl beside him. This is not a hospital, it is a monastery. And this is not science, it is faith practiced as medicine. In an age when illness was seen not merely as a biological misfortune, but a divine message, the church held profound authority over the sick. The boundary between healing and salvation was blurred. Curing the body often meant cleansing the soul. This is the story of how the church, through ritual, regimen, and remedy, became one of medieval Europe's most powerful and paradoxical medical institutions. Illness as divine judgment. To the medieval mind, disease had spiritual causes. Sin, individual or collective, invited illness. Suffering was not random but part of God's will. Plague might come because a town harbored heretics. Fevers might rise in a woman who had failed in modesty. Childbirth deaths were seen, at times, as divine punishment for Eve's transgression. And so healing required more than herbs or incantations. It required repentance. The afflicted were encouraged to confess sins, undertake pilgrimages, donate to the church, endure suffering patiently as a form of purification. Even when herbs were applied or procedures attempted, they were accompanied by prayer. Healing was an act of divine mercy, not medical intervention. Monastic infirmaries, the soul and the south. Though hospitals as we know them did not yet exist, monasteries served as centers of care, especially for the poor and pilgrims. Infirmaries were usually simple, quiet spaces, often near the cloister where monks could tend to the sick in a structured environment. Monastic healing combined religious routine with rudimentary medicine. The rule of Saint Benedict prescribed care for the sick as a holy duty. Daily life for patients included prayers, readings from scripture, and communal meals of broth and bread. Monks grew physic gardens filled with healing herbs: lavender, sage, mint, and hyssop. Clean linens were provided. Beds were simple but raised off the ground. Food was bland but nourishing. Crucially, these places were cleaner and more organized than most homes. And while monks were not physicians in the modern sense, many became skilled observers, noting which treatments eased which ailments. The role of clergy in everyday healing. Outside monasteries, parish priests were often the first people summoned to the sickbed. Their presence was not only spiritual, it was also practical. They delivered last rites, diagnosed ailments through confession and observation, referred patients to monasteries or pilgrimage sites, distributed blessed items, holy water, relics, and charms. Priests might suggest fasting to purify the humors, or penance to balance the spiritual body. They also maintained lists of local midwives, herbalists, and even barber surgeons, acting as informal healthcare coordinators. In many rural areas, where physicians were scarce or unaffordable, the church was the healer by default. Saints and shrines, healing by intercession. Certain saints were believed to possess healing power, especially when invoked through relics or visited at shrines. Saint Sebastian was believed to protect against plague. Saint Apollonia was the patron saint of toothache sufferers. Saint Roch, having survived plague himself, became widely venerated during outbreaks. Pilgrimage to shrines was considered both a remedy and a trial. The sick might crawl, walk barefoot, or travel long distances to reach sites where miracles were said to occur. Some claimed healing after contact with relics, bones, garments, or even drops of saints' blood. Others died en route or returned unchanged. But belief and hope were powerful medicines in themselves. Holy remedies, the merging of ritual and cure. Many church-sanctioned remedies blended physical treatment with religious ritual. Holy water was sprinkled over the sick or mixed with wine and consumed. Leeches were applied, with prayers recited over them. Exorcisms were performed on those with seizures or unexplained convulsions, interpreted as demonic possession. Holy oils, blessed during specific liturgical rites, were applied to wounds and sores. Monks also kept healing manuals, sometimes copied from older Roman or Greek texts, which included both herbal recipes and prayers. One common treatment involved writing scripture verses on parchment, then soaking them in water and giving the patient the ink-infused liquid to drink. Did it work? Not usually, but it reflected the core belief of the time, that words had power not just to comfort but to cure. Leeching and bloodletting, endorsed by the faithful. The Church's role in medical practice extended to humoral theory, particularly bloodletting, which was believed to balance the body's internal fluids. Though rooted in pagan antiquity, bloodletting was widely accepted by ecclesiastical healers. Clergy members were often trained in how and when to bleed a patient. Monasteries scheduled periodic bloodletting for monks as part of their calendar, a sort of spiritual and physical cleansing. Leeches were farmed and kept in jars, often placed behind the ears, on the temples, or near inflamed limbs. Patients might be bled while lying in chapel, with prayers chanted throughout. It was uncomfortable. It was often ineffective, but it was believed to be a part of God's design and earthly method for correcting spiritual imbalance. Faith in times of plague. During outbreaks like the Black Death, religious responses intensified. Processions of flagellants marched through towns, whipping themselves to atone for society's sins. Mass burials were accompanied by prayers and bells, even when no priests were available. Churches remained open even when filled with corpses. Many believed the plague was a test, or a punishment for widespread corruption, pride, or heresy. In this spiritual panic, healing sometimes took strange forms. Animals were sacrificed, priests performed public exorcisms, churches banned certain foods, dances, or songs. And yet, in all this ritual, there were still monks in garden infirmaries, tending to fevers with herbs, washing wounds, and whispering prayers for those too weak to respond. Final thoughts for Section 1. The Church was not merely a bystander in medieval medicine. It was a physician of the soul and, through monasteries, shrines, and rituals, a caretaker of the body. Its treatments were not always effective. Many were mystical, misguided, or outright harmful. but they were sincere, built on a belief that healing and holiness could not be separated. So we must ask, in a world where sickness was seen as a message from heaven, how did people distinguish between the cure and the curse? By the late Middle Ages, the Church's authority over the physical body was matched only by its control over the soul. Bishops and abbots gave blessings for surgeries. Priests mediated medical disputes. Monks wrote manuals that described both the illnesses of the flesh and the failings of the spirit. But as the centuries turned, a quiet tension began to build a friction between faith-based healing and the growing interest in rational medicine. It wasn't a dramatic break, nor a widespread rebellion. It was more like a slow unraveling of the certainties that had bound medicine to the altar. In this section, we explore the height of the Church's medical power, the practices it sanctioned or condemned, and how early skepticism crept into its sacred halls. The Church as regulator of medicine. By the 12th and 13th centuries, church councils began to formalize their control over medical practice, especially among clergy. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 forbade priests from performing surgical procedures involving blood, stating that those who shed blood could not serve at the altar. Monks were ordered to avoid dangerous procedures, pushing more invasive practices into the hands of barber surgeons and lay healers. Medical licenses in some regions began requiring ecclesiastical approval, especially in university cities where church and school were closely tied. This control had both positive and negative consequences. On one hand, the church helped to preserve ancient medical texts, establish some of the first medical ethics codes requiring oaths and conduct, operate widespread networks of infirmaries and leprosaria. On the other hand, it limited anatomical study, fearing desecration of the body, suppressed divergent theories, particularly if they contradicted doctrine, labeled certain folk remedies or female-led practices as heretical or demonic. In short, it held the keys to medicine, but wasn't always sure what doors it wanted to open. Universities, monks, and medical texts. Many monasteries and cathedral schools preserved the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, copying and annotating them alongside religious texts. These works, rich with detail about humors, diagnostics, and treatments, formed the foundation of medieval medical education. Church-controlled universities like Salerno in modern Italy, Montpellier, France, and later Oxford in Paris, became central nodes of medical learning. Yet even within these institutions, theology often overshadowed science. Courses began with astrology, understanding the celestial causes of illness; humoral theory, the spiritual alignment of bodily fluids; moral conduct, ensuring physicians were pious as well as learned. Still, within the church's protected walls, medicine gained legitimacy. Physicians became scholars, not just tradesmen, and with this rise in prestige came new questions about the limits of doctrine and the value of observation. Women healers and ecclesiastical suppression. As formal medicine became entwined with church authority, female healers, many of whom operated outside that structure, came under scrutiny. These women, often midwives, herbalists, or folk healers, provided essential care in rural areas, maintained oral traditions of plant-based remedies, handled childbirth, wounds, fevers, and domestic ailments. But their independence, combined with their influence, was threatening. The Malleus Maleficarum, 1487, a church-endorsed text, identified female healers as potential witches, accusing them of using sorcery rather than godly means. Inquisitions sometimes linked unexplained cures with diabolical interference. Women who treated plague victims and survived were suspected of supernatural protection or worse. Thus, centuries of community-based healing were pushed underground or erased from the official record. The church had not only prescribed medicine, it was now policing it. Saints, relics, and the political power of healing. The church's influence over healing extended beyond care into symbolism and spectacle. Pilgrimages to shrines became economic and political events. Towns that hosted a saint's relic gained prestige and coin. Miracles were carefully documented by ecclesiastical commissions, often used to justify sainthood. Local rulers sometimes fought over the ownership of relics, believing they brought health and protection. But not all believed. By the 14th century, complaints began to surface that miracles were fabricated or exaggerated, that some relics were doubtful or obviously fake, that indulgences and offerings for healing were veiled profiteering. These early murmurs of skepticism would only grow louder in the next century. The church during epidemics, devotion meets desperation. During plague outbreaks, the church played both heroic and tragic roles. Monks and priests administered last rites, often at great personal risk, dug graves and comforted the dying, maintained spiritual order when civil authority collapsed. But it also faltered. Clergy died in massive numbers, leaving spiritual vacuums. Some priests fled their parishes, unable to face the death toll. Rumors spread that God's own servants were no more protected than the poor. People asked, if priests die of plague like commoners, what protection does faith truly offer? And in that question, a crack appeared in the church's spiritual medical armor. Dissent and the slow rise of medical autonomy. In the late 14th and early 15th centuries, a handful of scholars began challenging the church's monopoly on truth in medicine. Gentile de Foligno wrote anatomical commentaries based on dissections, straying from Galenic orthodoxy. Trotula of Salerno, though her works were often rewritten under male pseudonyms, introduced practical remedies for women's health. Medical guilds in cities like London and Paris began to separate themselves from ecclesiastical control. Some physicians dared to question the humors, argue for empirical observation, conduct dissections, sometimes in secret. Still, these were cautious steps. Open defiance risked excommunication, accusation, or worse. But the tide was turning. The church had long prescribed both prayer and leeches. Now, some healers were suggesting it might be time to consider a third option: evidence. Final thoughts for Section 2. For centuries, the church held firm. Illness was divine, healing was sacred, and treatment was bound to ritual. It provided solace, structure, and the first institutional form of care for the sick. But power invites scrutiny, and when the faithful grew ill, when the devout died, just as swiftly as the wicked, the certainty that underpinned religious medicine began to erode. The question was no longer just what sin caused this sickness, but also, is there another explanation? And if there was, who had the right to pursue it? The candlelit infirmaries of monasteries, once Europe's quietest places of care, began to dim. In their place, new institutions emerged, no longer cloaked in cassocks and incense, but in ink-stained robes of scholars and surgeons. The church had dominated medieval medicine with a deeply spiritual understanding of the body. But slowly, over centuries, its sacred grip on healing loosened. This final section traces the slow transformation from pious prescription to practical procedure, and how, even in its retreat, the church left behind a legacy of healing that still echoes in the sterile corridors of modern hospitals. The turning point: healing as observation. By the 15th century, more healers were beginning to see the body not just as a vessel for the soul, but as an object of study. They measured pulses. They timed fevers. They took note of symptoms without first referencing sin. This subtle shift was revolutionary. Though Galen's teachings were still widely accepted, practitioners began to dissect cadavers, even when frowned upon by religious authorities. Write case histories, detailing symptoms and outcomes. Challenge the idea that illness was always moral or spiritual. The concept of natural causes of disease gained traction. Miasmas, bad water, and contaminated air became more widely accepted explanations. Faulty though these ideas were, they were grounded in the world, not the heavens. The church didn't disappear from medicine, but for the first time, it began to share the stage. The rise of secular hospitals. One of the most tangible signs of change was the emergence of civic hospitals. Previously, care for the sick had taken place in monastic infirmaries, where monks tended to both spirit and body. At pilgrimage shrines, where healing was hoped for, not expected. Through parish charity, which was often informal and inconsistent. But now, city governments began to establish hospitals. Florence's Ospedale di Santa Maria Nuova, founded in 1288 by a merchant, became a model for urban care. Paris's Hôtel Dieu, though founded earlier by the church, became increasingly influenced by civic medical authorities. In London, the re-establishment of St. Bartholomew's under royal charter separated it from exclusive ecclesiastical control. These institutions prioritized organization of care into wards, training of medical students under supervision, public health measures, including quarantine zones and sanitation. Clergy still played a role, especially as chaplains and moral advisors, but the authority over how to treat illness had begun to shift toward trained lay professionals. The church's enduring influence. Despite losing its monopoly, the church's legacy in medicine didn't vanish, it transformed. Hospitals. The church had normalized the idea that the sick deserved shelter and care. Even when secularized, this ethos remained. Compassionate care. The church emphasized dignity in death and comfort in pain principles retained in later nursing practices. Record keeping. Monasteries documented remedies, symptoms, and outcomes, preserving centuries of practical experience. Medical ethics. Many early codes of conduct, including ideas of confidentiality and service, were shaped by religious teachings. Even modern chaplaincy, found in hospitals across the world today, is a quiet echo of this role, the healer of the soul standing beside the healer of the body. Conflict and coexistence. In the early modern period, especially during the Reformation, tensions between church and medicine grew more explicit. Protestant reformers criticized the monetization of healing through relics and indulgences, the corruption of clergy who offered miraculous cures, the distrust of science, which was seen as limiting the potential of discovery. Meanwhile, Catholic institutions doubled down on their healing ministries, founding new hospital orders, such as the Daughters of Charity, medical missions, which blended evangelism with care, Jesuit colleges, which trained physicians in both theology and science. The result was not a clean break, but a complicated coexistence. In Catholic Europe, religious medicine persisted robustly into the 18th century. In Protestant regions, medicine began separating more rapidly from the church. But in both, the idea that healing had a higher purpose endured. From leeches to laboratory. By the 17th century, the dominance of humoral theory began to wane. The microscope was invented. The circulation of blood was discovered by William Harvey. Disease began to be understood as a physical process, not a moral one. In this new world, the church no longer dictated how a body should be treated, but it still influenced why it should be. Hospitals became places of science. Physicians relied on measurement, not prayer. Anatomy theaters replaced altars, but nurses still offered comfort. Chapels remained nearby. And the leech once applied with holy invocation became just a tool. measured and managed, without ritual. The echo in modern medicine. Walk into a hospital today and look closely. You may see crosses etched into stonework, saint names on hospital buildings, prayer rooms tucked beside operating wards, hospice programs rooted in monastic ideals of end-of-life dignity. The spiritual never left medicine, it simply took a quieter seat. And while no one prays over leeches anymore, the spirit of care, the belief that tending to the sick is a sacred responsibility, remains one of the Church's most enduring gifts to the healing arts. Final reflection. The Church once stood as gatekeeper of all knowledge, dictating not just how to live but how to die, how to suffer, and how to heal. Its tools were prayer, ritual, scripture, and sometimes leeches. It was not always correct, it was not always kind, but in a world of chaos it offered structure, meaning, and presence. And though medicine has moved into laboratories and lecture halls, it still walks with the echoes of monasteries, saints, and sacred hands, who believed that healing the body was never separate from healing the soul. Story 5. The Walled Villages, Self-Imposed Quarantines in the Age of Pestilence. Imagine a village in 14th century Europe, stone cottages clustered tightly together, fields stretching into the tree line, a modest parish church at its center. A single road leads in and out, worn down by years of boots, hooves, and wagon wheels. One morning, a rider appears at the edge of the path, too far to identify, too still to feel safe. Word has already come from the next town. The plague has arrived. People are dying by the dozens. Bread is left on doorsteps and no one answers. The village gathers at the churchyard. The elders speak. The decision is made. They will shut the gates. No one in, no one out. This is not fiction. Across Europe, from mountain hamlets in Italy to moorbound settlements in England, entire communities chose to isolate themselves, locking out the world in hopes of saving themselves from the creeping death. This is the story of the walled villages where quarantine meant cutting yourself off completely, not only from disease, but from help, trade, and escape. The logic of isolation. In the absence of medical understanding, the plague was a terrifying mystery. But even without germ theory, medieval people weren't stupid. They saw patterns. Towns with heavy traffic got sick first. Villages near ports or market roads fell quickly. Isolated communities, when they remained untouched, became examples. Some towns acted swiftly, closing gates, blocking roads with fallen trees or stones, placing guards at entrances, sometimes unpaid farmers with pitchforks. This wasn't state policy. There were no health departments. These were local, desperate decisions made by councils, priests, or even entire communities voting with raised hands. The goal was simple: wait out the plague. Physical barriers and symbolic boundaries. Most villages were not actually walled in the medieval urban sense. Instead, they created improvised perimeters, stacked stones across entry paths, dug shallow trenches, erected simple wooden gates or posted guards. But perhaps more powerful than the physical wall was the mental and social wall. Strangers were treated with suspicion or outright turned away. Goods from outside were left at a designated stone or well to be collected later. Coins were soaked in vinegar before being accepted, if accepted at all. Many communities created what we would now call cordon sanitaires, zones where goods could be exchanged without contact. These boundaries were ritualistic as much as practical. They reinforced the collective belief: we are on one side of this, the plague is on the other. The village of Iam, a famous example. In England, one of the most well-documented examples of self-quarantine occurred in Iam, Derbyshire, in 1665 during the Great Plague. The disease arrived in a parcel of cloth. The village rector, William Mompesson, urged the community to quarantine themselves to prevent spread to neighboring towns. I.M. agreed. A boundary was set: no one left, no one entered. Food was left at stones on the outskirts, where coins soaked in vinegar were exchanged. Over the next year, roughly 260 out of 350 villagers died. But nearby villages Stony Middleton, Grindleford, Bakewell were spared. I.M.'s story has become a symbol of self-sacrifice, though it's worth noting. Not all quarantined villages had the same resolve or the same outcome. Daily life inside the walls. Inside a quarantined village, life slowed to a crawl. Fear dominated. Churches remained open but sparsely attended. Trade halted. Food supplies dwindled. Without outside markets, villagers relied on root cellars, local livestock, often slaughtered early to prevent losses. Foraging, sometimes in dangerous proximity to the quarantine edge. In some places, fields went unplowed. In others, entire families moved into barns or woods to avoid shared indoor air. People slept apart, songs fell silent, celebrations were canceled. For many, the silence was worse than the disease. Governance and decision-making. Who decided to shut a village? Often, clergy, citing divine warning or biblical precedent. Village councils or elders, leaning on folk wisdom and local traditions. In some cases, the entire village, by mutual agreement. The act of self-quarantine was, in effect, a form of governance, a public health order before the concept existed. It required consensus, discipline, and most of all, trust. Betraying the quarantine, sneaking out to see family, accepting travelers, buying forbidden goods was seen not just as a risk, but as a moral failure. Betrayal, flight, and desperation. Not every village held firm. Some began quarantine, only to break it after the first death. Others splintered, young men fled, families scattered. In a few tragic cases, violence erupted. Accusations of selfishness, cowardice, or even witchcraft emerged. There were stories of villagers tying their own gates shut with church bells to signal breaking the quarantine. Parents refusing to bury their children for fear of breaking the boundary line. Travelers being killed for crossing into the wrong area. What began as unity sometimes fractured under the weight of hunger, grief, and fear. And yet some endured. Final thoughts for Section 1. The walled villages were not utopias of discipline. They were places of last resort, quiet battles of survival fought not with medicine or armies, but with sacrifice, stubbornness, and silence. Some succeeded, some failed, all paid a price. But their story raises an enduring question. What does a community owe itself and its neighbors when danger arrives just outside the gate? The gates were closed, the road blocked, the messenger turned away. And so the village waited. Quarantine was not a passive condition, it was a daily struggle. For those who shut themselves off from the world, every sunrise brought new uncertainties. What would they eat? Who would fall sick next? How long could they hold out? In this section, we explore what it was like inside a self-quarantined village. The rhythms of survival, the systems of cooperation, the quiet tensions, and the slow unraveling of normal life. Because isolation was not just about stopping the disease, it was about outlasting it together if possible. Food, the first crisis. The moment a village closed itself off, food became a central concern. Markets stopped. No more wheat from neighboring towns, no salt, no spices. Foraging became limited, especially in cold months. Livestock was consumed early and sparingly, each sheep or pig, a life-or-death asset. In some villages, food was rationed by elders or councils who tracked households and consumption. Churches, where extra stores were hidden in crypts or barns. informal leaders like millers or bakers who controlled grain stores. Grain was stretched with roots and bark. Bread was made smaller. Some people turned to acorns, nettles, or mossy mushrooms. Boiled water became broth. In hard-hit places, pets were eaten. Stories of famine cannibalism appear in local folklore, though most remain unverified. Still, hunger was as real as any disease. Work and roles in quarantine. Even cut off from the world, the village could not stop moving. Fields still needed tending, if only to prepare for life after the plague. But laborers were scarce, and tasks became improvised. Children herded animals, once tended by men lost to the plague. Women baked, boiled, and buried, caring for the sick and preparing bodies. Elders kept watch, recorded names, and said prayers. In many communities, the division of labor collapsed. Status meant less. Landowners worked alongside their tenants. Priests delivered food. Healers dug graves. Necessity flattened the hierarchy, at least temporarily. And though some hoarded or hid, most villagers understood one truth. If we don't survive together, we don't survive at all. Spiritual life in a sealed world. With churches closed to outsiders and some priests among the dead, villagers turned inward for comfort. Religion remained a powerful force, but its expressions changed. Outdoor services were held in churchyards, with families spaced apart. Bell ringing marked deaths, births, or safe deliveries of food from beyond. Portable altars were used by those too afraid to gather. Psalms were whispered instead of sung. Priests who remained often did more than spiritual work. They recorded names of the dead. They performed burials without ceremony. They administered last rites through doors, or shouted blessings from yards. And for those without clergy, spiritual life became domestic. Crosses carved into door frames. Rosaries passed between families. Prayers said over boiling pots and fresh graves. Faith in these months was not elaborate. It was desperate, intimate, and constant. Death inside the walls. Despite precautions, some quarantine villages were still struck by plague. Once it entered through a contaminated delivery, a secret meeting, or a fleeing visitor, containment was nearly impossible. When death arrived, entire households vanished within days. Bodies were sometimes buried in home gardens when graveyards filled. Children were left orphaned, sometimes hidden by neighbors. Villagers resorted to mass pits, dug with shaking hands and covered quickly. Those tasked with caring for the dead often became the next to die. But without them, rot and despair spread faster than infection. And yet, rituals persisted. Coins placed on the eyes. Small stones stacked at the feet of graves. A final word whispered, even if no one remained to hear it. Messages from the outside. Though cut off, some villages maintained limited contact with the world beyond. Food deliveries were arranged left at agreed-upon places. A hollowed tree stump, a stone circle, a plague cross carved into a marker. Coins were exchanged, soaked in vinegar, sometimes placed in cracked bowls filled with salt or urine. Messages were scratched into bark or stone, short notes. "We live, send oats, too late." These drop points became sacred ground, approached only with care, cleaned by smoke or lie, avoided during wind. The rules were clear. No one could speak face to face. No one could linger. Everything touched must be treated. Fear turned communication into ritual. Fractures in faith. Not all quarantined villages held together. Some split, with factions forming between those who favored stricter isolation and those who wanted to risk opening. Fights broke out, especially over hoarding, inheritance, or failed crops. In rare cases, accusations of sorcery were made, especially against healers whose families stayed healthy. Others became stronger. Couples married during quarantine, believing it a blessing. Children forged deep friendships under pressure. Villages formed councils that would later shape more democratic local governance. But the mental toll was immense. The phrase after the plague became both hope and curse. Hope that life would return, curse in that no one could agree what life had been before. Final thoughts for Section 2. Behind the walls, survival wasn't just about keeping the plague out. It was about keeping people together, fed, faithful, and focused on the thin line between discipline and despair. These villages didn't have doctors. They didn't have science. They had only each other and the belief that by locking the world out, they might protect the world within. But when the gates finally opened, what remained? Would the silence lift? Would the fields bloom again? Or had too much already been lost? The wind carried no stench now. The birds had returned tentatively, singing above fields that once lay fallow. The trees along the road had dropped their leaves. Another season had passed. And then someday, months after the last knock at the gate, after the final burial, someone unbarred the entrance. The village was no longer walled, but it was also no longer whole. This final section tells the quiet aftermath of the self-quarantined villages, what reopening meant, how survivors re-entered the world, and how communities rebuilt in the shadow of their own difficult decision. Not all villages were remembered in history books. Some left only overgrown wells, moss-covered stones, or a hollow in the earth where a church once stood. But all left behind lessons, passed down not in words, but in ritual, caution, and custom. The first step outside. When the decision was made to reopen, it was not done lightly. The elders gathered, or whoever remained, to discuss reports from nearby towns. Scouts or messengers were sometimes sent out first, young, healthy survivors tasked with checking the roads, markets, or parishes beyond. Bells were rung, not to mourn this time, but to signal a new beginning. Often the gates creaked open into silence. The outside world had changed. Neighboring towns had their own scars, empty inns, collapsed farms, unfamiliar names. Trade routes had shifted. Inheritance lines were broken. Some families had vanished entirely. Villagers stepped into a world where everyone had suffered, but not everyone had shut themselves away. Returning to a world that had moved on. Self-quarantine saved lives, but it also meant missed opportunities, misalignment, and mistrust. Land disputes emerged as neighboring communities claimed abandoned territory. Local economies struggled to reconnect to broader trade networks. Religious tension flared when some saw quarantine as an act of cowardice or pride. And then there was the question no one said aloud. Why did they survive when others did not? Some viewed the survivors with awe as chosen, protected, even holy. Others viewed them with resentment as lucky, selfish, or superstitious. Rejoining the world meant rebuilding not just trade and walls, but trust. How memory took root. Most of these walled villages left no written record, but their stories lived on. In local legends about families who vanished and homes that burned. In rituals, like placing bread and vinegar at the edge of town each spring. In songs murmured under breath, remembering the days when silence ruled. Some customs endured long after the reason was forgotten. Wells kept separate for outsiders' water. Coins washed before market day. A carved stone cross at the village edge, worn by time and lichen. In a few villages, entire anniversaries were built around the memory of surviving quarantine. A single candle left burning in an empty chapel. A communal meal where no one spoke for the first few minutes. Bells rung once for each life lost, and once more for those who endured. The quarantine became not just a story of survival, but a story of identity. Who stayed, who left? Not all survivors remained. Some, especially the young, left the village behind, walking towards cities in search of work, love, or meaning. Others stayed but never truly returned to daily life. They lived on the edge of the village, avoided gatherings, planted gardens where the sick had once lain. Many survivors struggled with what we might now call trauma, but without language for it, they bore it silently. Still, life resumed. Fields were tilled again. Children were born. Marriages were held quietly, then more joyfully. Walls that had once sealed them in became garden edges, chicken pens, or vanished altogether. The village moved forward, not by forgetting, but by folding the past into its bones. What the world learned. While individual quarantines were scattered and isolated, their impact rippled outward. In later plague outbreaks, authorities mimicked village practices, ordering cordons and isolation zones. Medical guides referenced past examples, using them as models of containment. Folklore celebrated or warned against such isolation, depending on the teller. Though crude by modern standards, these communities had grasped the basic truth of containment. Stop the movement, stop the spread. They did it without charts, masks, or state orders. They did it with rope, prayer, and resolve. Reflections across time. In the 21st century, we understand disease differently. We have hospitals, vaccines, global networks of research and care. And yet, when modern plagues appear, what do? We shut borders, we close doors, we count cases, we light candles in windows, we leave groceries at thresholds, we wave from the other side of glass. We still build walls, not of stone, but of distance. We still ask, how long must we wait? Who gets to leave? Who decides? And we still look to those before us, consciously or not, who did the same with fewer tools, but no less courage. Final reflection. The walled villages of the plague era are rarely named in history books. They weren't grand cities. They had no kings, no armies, no physicians, just people. People who chose isolation over desperation. People who lost family, friends, and faith, but who held the gates shut anyway. And when the plague passed and the gates opened, they stepped forward not as the same community, but as something new. Not just survivors. Witnesses. Story 6, Plague Ships and Floating Coffins, Port Cities and the Price of Trade. A gull cries over the harbor. The salt-laced wind blows inland. A bell rings faintly as a ship nears the docks. On board, barrels of spice, bolts of cloth, cages of exotic birds, and several dead men wrapped in tarred sailcloth, tucked quietly below deck. The year is 1347. The port city is bustling, but in the ship's dark belly, death is already awake. This is the beginning of the story of plague ships, silent vessels that carried more than goods. They brought pestilence into the heart of the medieval world's greatest hubs of commerce, culture, and population. Venice, Marseille, Genoa, Alexandria, Constantinople each paid the price for prosperity. In this section, we explore how plague entered Europe not just on foot, but by sail, and how cities connected to the world found themselves uniquely vulnerable to its dangers. The trade routes that made and unmade cities. Medieval trade flourished across the Mediterranean and Black Sea, connecting Europe to the riches of the East, North Africa to spices and silks, and Byzantine ports to the rising powers of Italy. Merchant ships crisscrossed the seas, carrying grain, wine, textiles, glassware, and precious metals. Crew members from all corners of the world. Rats nesting in the hold, feeding on crumbs and waste. Fleas hiding in straw, rags, fur, and rope. Ports were dense, merchants eager, time mattered. Few asked questions when a ship arrived, especially if the goods were valuable. But in 1347, everything changed. The ship from the east. One of the most infamous plague arrivals occurred when a fleet of Genoese ships, fleeing the siege of Caffa in the Crimea, arrived at Messina, Sicily. Accounts describe Crew weakened or dead. Black swellings in the armpits and groin. Sailors vomiting blood. Dockworkers falling ill within days. Despite warnings, the ships were allowed to land briefly. Goods were unloaded. Merchants disembarked. Some locals boarded to inspect the holds. Within weeks, the plague exploded across Sicily. The ships, now turned away, continued down the coast, stopping at Genoa, Pisa, Marseille, and Barcelona. Each new port brought more death. The limits of curiosity and control. Why did cities continue to allow suspicious ships to dock? Denial. Many port authorities refused to believe the early rumors. Desperation. Trade was a lifeline, especially in winter or famine years. Speed. Plague symptoms could take days to appear. By then, cargo was already unloaded. And some decisions were simply tragic errors. Unloading of contaminated textiles. Contact with infected crew during loading. Disposal of dead bodies into harbor waters. In the medieval worldview, disease might come from the air or from moral corruption, but almost never from the ship's hold. The idea that cloth could carry death, unthinkable, yet that's exactly what happened. Life aboard a plague ship. While few first-hand records survive from infected ships, accounts from the period suggest grim realities. Crew members developed symptoms at sea, far from help. Corpses were thrown overboard to prevent panic. Rats ran freely below decks, drawn to grain. Water turned brackish, food spoiled. Sailors, often superstitious, attributed deaths to curses or punishment. Some ships were found adrift, their crews dead, sails flapping idly, floating coffins steered only by wind and current. Even healthy ships avoided those flagged for disease. In ports like Dubrovnik and Venice, watchers were posted at sea walls to spot ships with plague rumors before they could anchor. The birth of maritime quarantine. As the death toll rose, some port cities began to change tactics. The idea of quarantine by sea was pioneered in cities like Ragusa, Dubrovnik, which in 1377 required ships to anchor for 30 to 40 days before disembarking. Venice, which built lazarettos, islands used to isolate ships, cargo, and crew. Marseille, which designated a harbor quarantine area known as the Infirmerie des Galères. These measures included inspection of crew by physicians, burning of clothing and bedding, monitoring for symptoms before allowing contact. Though not always effective, these policies laid the groundwork for modern public health measures. Ironically, the same maritime networks that spread disease also helped spread knowledge of containment. Dockworkers, rats, and the city gates. In most port cities, plague spread not just through sailors but through dockworkers, customs agents, and laborers. Grain warehouses became hotspots. Rats leapt from ships to dock ropes to city walls. Fleas hopped onto clothing, boots, and livestock. By the time the first fevers appeared inland, the web was already woven. Some cities responded by closing gates, banning certain goods, burning ships suspected of contamination. But these measures were inconsistent and often too late. As one chronicler in Marseille wrote, "The sickness came with the sails, it spread with the carts, and we only closed the gates after the wind had already passed through." Final thoughts for Section 1. The plague came to Europe not just by foot, but by tide and timber. It arrived with cargo, coin, and curiosity. No one meant to bring it, but in their eagerness to trade, port cities invited the world in, and with it, the seeds of devastation. So we must ask, in a time when the sea connected everything, was isolation even possible? And what would it mean to choose safety over survival? By the mid-14th century, the mystery of plague was still unresolved, but one fact was clear: it traveled with people, animals, and ships. The great port cities, once gateways to fortune and fame, had become thresholds of death. And so, in time, came the next logical step. If you could not stop the sea or close the ports forever, perhaps you could create a space between the ship and the city. A space for waiting. A space for watching. A space called the lazaretto. The origins of quarantine. The idea of quarantine, literally, 40 giorni, or 40 days, emerged in Ragusa, now Dubrovnik, in 1377, during one of the many plague waves after the Black Death. The rule was straightforward. Anyone arriving by ship had to wait in isolation for 30 to 40 days. This included sailors, passengers, goods, and even animals. No contact with the city was allowed until the period passed without illness. The goal was not to punish, but to protect. It was a time buffer based on religious, medical, and folk belief that most diseases would show symptoms within a month. Soon, other cities adopted similar rules. Venice built the first official lazaretto on Santa Maria di Nazareth, later called Lazaretto Vecchio, in 1423. Marseille, Genoa, and Pisa followed suit. These quarantine stations became permanent features, part hospital, part prison, part bureaucratic checkpoint. What was a lazaretto? Lazarettos varied in design, but most shared key features. Located on islands, peninsulas, or walled coastal compounds. Contained segregated buildings, for the mildly sick, the clearly infected, and the clean but waiting. Had guards at all entrances and restricted movement within. Included storage sheds for quarantined goods, barrels, cloth, oil, and even livestock. Upon arrival, ships were flagged and boarded by inspectors. Crew were questioned, cargo tagged. Anyone with symptoms was immediately isolated. Others were sent to observation dormitories, where they waited. No one entered the city until the quarantine was complete. Life in a lazaretto. For those inside, life in quarantine was marked by boredom. Days passed slowly, with little to do and no contact with family or employers. Fear. Every cough, every fever, every new case could reset the waiting period. Suspicion. Fellow travelers were viewed not as companions, but as possible sources of infection. Discomfort. Bedding was minimal, food plain, and conditions crowded in peak seasons. Some left diaries describing the endless repetition of prayers, meals, and packing. Others described confusion, unclear rules, contradictory messages, guards acting arbitrarily. And some wrote about the smell of vinegar of the sea of the sick. Commerce in isolation. Goods didn't escape quarantine either. Textiles were hung on lines in the open air. Furs were beaten and smoked. Crates were opened and examined by gloved or cloth-wrapped hands. Some cities required soaking cargo in vinegar or brine. This often caused financial losses, delays, and frustration, but most merchants accepted it as a cost of doing business. Others tried to cheat the system, bribing inspectors, falsifying manifests, claiming illness aboard was due to bad fish or unclean water. Such actions were punished harshly, occasionally, with ship confiscation or public whipping. Bureaucracy and public health. By the 15th and 16th centuries, lazarettos had become centers of early epidemiological practice. Ledgers recorded names, origins, symptoms, and durations. Physicians, though still guided by Galenic theories, began noting patterns. City health boards emerged, precursors to ministries of health. In Venice, inspectors wore long robes, gloves, and even primitive face coverings, early forms of protective equipment. And from these bureaucratic foundations came a new concept. Disease could be traced, managed, contained. It wasn't magic, it wasn't punishment, it was something human choices could influence. Tensions at the threshold. Not everyone agreed with quarantines or lazarettos. Merchants argued that delays ruined profit and trade relations. Sailors viewed them as punishment for invisible crimes. Citizens feared that the lazaretto might itself become a source of infection. There were riots. In Livorno, sailors refused to disembark. In Naples, citizens protested near the docks when plague ships were anchored nearby. In Barcelona, warehouse owners resisted moving goods to quarantine stations. And there were escapes, jumping from windows into the sea, bribing guards to deliver messages, sneaking into the city under cover of night. Each breach risked another outbreak. Successes and limitations. Did quarantine work? In many cases, yes. Cities with enforced maritime quarantines often avoided the first waves of new outbreaks. The 40-day wait was long enough to reveal most symptomatic cases. Trade resumed in a more controlled fashion, allowing cities to balance health and economy. But quarantine was not a silver bullet. Asymptomatic carriers went undetected. Disease sometimes spread through rats and fleas, not just people or goods. Enforced quarantine depended on obedience, honesty, and luck. Still, the lazaretto stood as a symbol of something new. A city's attempt to stand between the world and its own undoing. Final thoughts for Section 2. The lazaretto was not a place of healing. It was a place of waiting, a gray zone between freedom and danger, between commerce and collapse. It asked travelers, merchants, and citizens alike to pause, to consider, to accept delay for the sake of the whole. But as weeks turned into months, and more ships queued in the harbor, how long could people wait before the city gave in to pressure? And could even the most disciplined system hold back a tide of death when the sea itself refused to rest? The storm had passed. The harbor was quiet again. The sails hung limp, the bells still. From the sea wall you could look out and see no approaching masts, no flags fluttering with news of foreign trade. Yet for those who lived through it, the sea was never the same again. This final section explores the aftermath of the plague's arrival by ship, how port cities adapted, remembered, and tried to control what had once seemed uncontrollable. It was not just a shift in public health. It was a shift in how people saw the world beyond their docks. After the floating coffins had come and gone, could a city ever truly feel safe again? Cleaning the docks. As plague years gave way to recovery, port cities began to reassess their priorities. The docks, once symbols of vitality, were now tainted, not just physically, but psychologically. The scent of spice could evoke memories of sickness. The creak of a ship's hull might stir dread rather than anticipation. Cities began implementing permanent sanitation and inspection systems, including regular cleansing of docks with lime or vinegar, designated rat catchers, sometimes paid per tail, construction of stone barriers to reduce rodent migration, mandatory ship fumigations using herbs, sulfur, or smoke. Though the science was imperfect, the intent was clear. The sea must still connect us, but no longer at any cost. Institutionalizing quarantine. After the early experiments with quarantine in Ragusa and Venice, other cities formalized their practices. Marseille established a lazaretto so large it became its own maritime village, with staff, guards, and chapels. Livorno passed laws detailing how long different types of goods had to be aired, beaten, or burned. London, though less reliant on Mediterranean trade, began stationing watchmen at its river docks during outbreaks. By the 17th century, many major port cities had permanent quarantine officers trained in inspection, quarantine hospitals for ill travelers and sailors, printed regulations posted at docks. Some cities even issued Bill of Health certificates, declaring a ship's last port free from plague. These documents could be forged, but they signaled a growing understanding that tracking movement mattered. The economics of fear. Despite these precautions, trade never stopped completely. The sea was still the artery of wealth and necessity, but now it flowed under new rules, shaped by fear and memory. Ships from the east might be delayed for months. Merchants factored quarantine time into their pricing. Cities created plague tariffs, charging for inspections, fumigation, and holding goods. Insurance also emerged covering losses due to disease-related delays. A kind of epidemic economy was born, in which safety was monetized, delay was taxed, uncertainty became a budget line. Even pestilence had its price. The human toll, remembered and forgotten. Port city cemeteries filled faster than they could be expanded. Mass graves dotted the outskirts, especially near lazarettos and sailor districts. Some cities responded by building monuments to victim statues, plaques, crosses, holding annual processions of mourning, naming streets or districts after the year of plague, or the saint believed to protect the sick. In Venice, the Festa del Redentore began in 1577, commemorating deliverance from a particularly terrible plague. A bridge of boats still leads pilgrims across the lagoon once a year. And yet much was forgotten. Sailors' names lost in port ledgers. Burial sites unmarked. Lazarettos abandoned, turned to warehouses or prisons. The silence of the harbor hid more than the echoes of death. It buried the stories of those who had lived in between arrival and escape. Shifts in worldview. The repeated arrival of plague by ship forced port cities and the wider world to reconsider more than health. It raised questions of global interconnectedness. Could one city ever truly stand alone? Responsibility. Should merchants be held liable for what they carried? Borders and freedom. Who had the right to enter? Who had the right to refuse? These questions remain with us. Every customs declaration, health screening, and port of entry rule today echoes back to those ships bobbing in medieval harbors, carrying fate in their bellies. Ghosts in the harbor. Even today, the legacy of plague ships lingers. In Venice, Lazaretto Vecchio is being excavated. Over 1,500 skeletons have been found stacked in trenches, wrapped in cloth. In Marseille, the old Lazaretto walls still bear scorch marks from the fumigations. In Dubrovnik, the original quarantine rules are preserved in archives, a testament to early attempts at controlled contagion. And in older parts of cities, some still whisper that rats return when the air grows still, or that certain stones at the dock never dry. Superstition, maybe. But memory has a way of clinging, like salt, like rust, like a name scrawled on the underside of a ship's beam. Final reflection. The plague ships did not just carry death. They carried questions. They carried the earliest drafts of public health, of global anxiety, of the invisible line between commerce and catastrophe. Port cities, once proud thresholds of civilization, learned that with every new arrival came the chance of unraveling. And yet they persisted. They mourned, rebuilt, regulated, and remembered. They kept the sea open, but never again forgot what it could bring. Even now, when a ship enters the harbor, a part of that long, shadowed history enters with it. Do we still listen for the echo of the bell? Do we still pause before we welcome the wind?